can we summarize the effects of sleep quality and impaired sleep quality on metabolism?
Well, I can speak even more about, let's say, sleep. Well, it depends on how you look at it, but sleep duration, we know that if you don't get enough sleep, that you have a higher risk of developing conditions such as type 2 diabetes and obesity. And part of that is through worsening your insulin sensitivity probably over time. And you also disrupt the function of, for example, skeletal muscle, adipose tissue, and even how your liver works, and your gut, and your gut microbiome. So a lot of different factors, and it's also like this. It's a very interconnected set of phenomena that happens, right? Because you also then, like we discussed earlier, promote, for example, overeating and eating of less healthy foods. And that in turn can worsen your insulin sensitivity and so on.
Right, and that's reduced sleep quantity, right? Yeah. So reduced sleep quantity is terrible for your metabolism. One could summarize it as.
Yeah, and again, we have to then say that now we're talking about someone who's doing this chronically.
Yeah.
Again, with the caveat that everyone has different sleep needs.
Yeah, sure.
But I would say that we know, for example, as a risk factor, that not getting enough sleep or having different symptoms of insomnia is as important of a risk factor for developing type 2 diabetes as being physically inactive. And we know how we always get, these, everyone is like always emphasizing, repeating how not enough people are meeting these recommendations.
Yeah.
But yeah, sleep is just as important, basically.
Right.
And also, and that from that perspective, you can even say that sleep is even more important for some regards because it also helps keep you motivated for doing all those healthy behaviors.
Right.
Such as eating right and exercising.
Yeah. Could you speak about the mechanisms of that? Like, how does enough sleep, and maybe even if you know anything about the sleep architecture or the sleep quality, how do these factors influence, like, maybe reward circuitry in the brain that in turn result in increased motivation for health promoting behaviors?
Yeah, so part of what happens when you don't sleep enough is that you have a harder time regulating your inhibitions, and also your emotional reactivity changes. You can basically get too high at emotional reactivity, which, let's say, similar to that, what you may have experienced in regular life is that just becomes like you think that everything is harder than it normally is.
Right.
Like whatever someone says, you may overanalyze it or not interpret it correctly. And with that, in what I mentioned about inhibition, that's one aspect that we know, again, is not functioning optimally, is your, let's say, ability to resist things that provide immediate rewards like food.
Jonathan?
Yeah.
Thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.
So I was thinking we could start the podcast talking about some recent events. Well, I don't know if the research is really recent, but I saw you posting on LinkedIn recently about weekend catch-up sleep.
Oh, yeah.
Do you want to share with us like the potential benefits of it, but also the limitations of it?
Yeah. So a lot of people are currently suffering from like chronic sleep loss. Basically, on the population level, we have up to 30 or 40% of adults and also a high proportion of children who don't get enough sleep. So for adults, typically you want to aim for between 7 and 9 hours. Some people need a little bit less, some need a little bit more, but that's the average based on the consensus, the totality of evidence that we have. So with that background, we know that a lot of people are still getting not enough sleep. So the proportion who gets around 6 or less hours is actually about 30% for adults, and it's been so for many years. And what often happens instead is that those people may be getting a bit less sleep during weekdays because of work requirements and so on. Let's say the commute is long. And so then naturally they build up the sleep need, so sleep depth. And what ends up happening is on the weekend, they try to catch up on sleep.
Right.
Because their sleep need, what they would like to aim for, what they would feel best with, is actually sleeping maybe somewhere between 7 to 9 hours each night.
Yeah.
Those people then, they build up the sleep depth, and they end up wanting to sleep more, and they do sleep often more on the weekend. And so there's benefits to that, because then the average, they reduce their sleep debt, basically. And studies have shown that there are benefits to then being able to catch up on some sleep during the weekend. So there's some studies that show that that's associated with a lower risk of hypertension, developing obesity, and also in terms of mortality.
The compared groups then are people who catched up on their sleep and people who didn't, but also had sleep deprivation during the weeks.
Yeah, basically. So, but the problem is then that what ends up happening with a lot of people who do catch up on sleep is that you often may, for example, still go to bed much later, or you sleep in much later, because let's say you go to bed at the same time as usual, but you want to catch up on sleep. Then you need to sleep more in the morning. You need to sleep longer in the morning.
Mm-hmm.
So this can then result in what's known as social jet lag, because now you are shifting your sleep-wake timing between work days during the weekday, basically, and then the weekend. And then when Monday comes again, if you're working on a regular schedule, you then have to switch back your sleep timing.
Right.
So you have to wake up earlier. And that back and forth in your sleep-wake schedule is called social jet lag. And we know that, which is a form of basically sleep irregularity, is associated with an increased risk of numerous conditions, such as basically gaining more weight, becoming obese, or developing cardiometabolic disruption, such as higher cholesterol and a higher risk of type 2 diabetes.
I was thinking about this connection between metabolic diseases and cardiometabolic diseases and sleep disruption. And I was thinking about whether the downstream consequences of these, are the complications of the metabolic diseases, such as hypertension, do they cause sleep loss as well? Or is it that we've found connections between the metabolic diseases and overweight and obesity? Or is it both the metabolic disease and the overweight and obesity and the downstream consequence? Or is it just...
It's very much like you suggest. There's a bidirectional relationship. And this we see for many of the conditions that insufficient or disrupted sleep are associated with. So this also applies to neurodegenerative disease, where we, in both cases, know that it's not only that the fact that sleep disruption increases the risk of that condition, such as obesity or type 2 diabetes, or let's say cardiovascular disease. But we also know that that condition also often is associated with disrupted sleep or insufficient sleep. And we don't fully understand why in some cases. But there is the potential for a vicious cycle, of course, where first, for example, say you have insufficient sleep that increases your risk of this condition. You develop the condition, and then that in turn worsens your sleep. Often the temporal relationship is hard to disentangle, of course. We don't know. Sometimes we don't really, or not yet at least, don't have the chicken and egg answer.
Yeah, I see. So there are correlations, but we don't really know the causal direction of the relationship.
And sometimes we, as sleep researchers, there are cases where we think that the evidence is pretty strong. So, for example, we recently argued that the evidence for sleep disruption causing neurodegenerative disease is quite strong because we have long-term follow-up data, we have mechanistic animal data that both show that if you start off with disrupted sleep or if you cause disrupted sleep, you then promote neurodegeneration or increase the risk of neurodegenerative disease up to several years, decades later, actually, in humans. But others see the evidence as less strong and argue that you cannot, even at that point in time, determine whether there is some underlying neurodegeneration, for example, in humans, which then could cause a sleep disruption that is just an indicator of the neurodegenerative process.
Yeah, yeah. So what I hear you say is that there are both camps within the research community as regards the relationship between neurodegenerative diseases and sleep disruption, as regards the direction of the relationship between the two.
What I would say is if you look at sleep researchers, I think that many would argue that there is definitely that causality in both directions has been shown. But we may not have convinced other researchers who are more outside the sleep field. That's at least my impression of it. Because again, I think that the evidence is pretty convincing. But there's certainly the case that if you are suffering from a neurodegenerative disease, you also often see disruption of sleep and circadian rhythms. And that's also an interesting aspect because we know that there's some studies that show that if you try to improve that, you may be able to improve at least symptoms, but also potentially the prognostic curve of that condition.
Yeah, yeah. And it seems very intuitive to me that sleep is a restorative process, and then that the well, pathological biological processes that facilitate neurodegeneration would be at least slowed in their progression from better sleep over time. But the other direction of the relationship, so neurodegeneration causing worse sleep, can you elaborate a bit on the mechanisms for how that would happen?
Yeah, so I think there are numerous ways. I can't say that I know have the full literature in my head right now, but what we do know, for example, is if you promote these neurodegenerative pathways such as amyloid beta, that can cause disrupted sleep and circadian rhythms. And you can do this in animals.
Yeah.
And with aging, we know that there is neurodegeneration occurring, and that has been followed longitudinally in people. And what you then see is that if you have, let's say, signs of more neurodegeneration or, let's say, atrophy, which can correlate with neurodegeneration, there's an association with worse sleep quality and circadian rhythms.
Right. And is that like global brain atrophy, or is it like local to the suprachiasmatic nucleus or something?
Yeah, so they have done analysis where they look specifically at sleep-wake regulating centers, and there is indeed a correlation between neurodegeneration in those hypothalamic regions that we know control sleep-wake cycles and worse sleep metrics over time.
Yeah. So it is local to those regions
Yeah.
then. Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. And do they do that research by imaging or?
Yeah, so it's done by MRI imaging, basically.
Yeah. Yeah. I was thinking we could take a step back in your career and in your journey to becoming a sleep researcher, what motivated you to start doing research in this field?
So there were several factors that led me onto this path. One of them was basically going through medical school. I experienced I guess the first aspect was really how memory was affected by not sleeping enough. So I remember studying for exams and thinking that it was best to study very late and not get enough sleep. But while that felt great at the moment, you really notice soon how much memory could be affected if you didn't get enough sleep. And um, and I was also fascinated by, because I've always been very active, and I also noticed when I was physically active or wanted to work out that my motivation and um, performance, so to say, like how my muscles would work when I was, for example, running or so, that was very much affected by how much sleep I got.
Yeah.
So those two factors were, noticeable to me. And I was also kind of fascinated. I had this fascination with consciousness at the time, I remember. And I was also kind of fascinated by the fact that consciousness is so altered, like we're not conscious when we're sleeping.
Yeah.
Yet somehow we're just like flashing back into, life when we wake up. And it's like nothing has happened. We're just back and we're just like, and that's like this long period of the day or night that we just ignore. And then we didn't learn much about it during medical school. So that just added to the fascination of like, what's going on? How is all this working? What's going on during sleep?
Yeah.
And then an equal, very important factor was the fact that my grandfather has been very much a pioneer in several regards or aspects of sleep and circadian research, where he did a lot of seminal studies on the role of melatonin and how you measure it in humans.
So was that a topic at the dinner table at home when you grew up, or?
Yeah, but we're well, the first thing I remember of that in that field was that I was actually part of a documentary on how light worked.
Okay.
Yeah, on the importance of light for sleep.
Were you or were your?
I was. It was a very short like segment where I featured. I think I was climbing in a tree, and one of my other brothers, he was actually sleeping, and yeah, it was us two being filmed
Okay.
as part of this. It was just like very short cameos, something. But that that I think that was sort of seeing that growing up. I got fascinated with what is really research, like at a very young age, and then he was also part of the Noble Assembly. And so, yeah, there were some very interesting dinner conversations.
Yeah. Interesting. And as regards the sleep deprivation experiences with physical performance during exercise and also cognitive during your studies, how severe was the sleep deprivation that you induced in yourself?
During medical school, I guess it wasn't horrible. I think that I did a few night shifts, of course, but then um, I remember I always got some sleep before an exam because, as I'm sure you've also experienced that they can be up to like 6 hours. So, and I could never do that without any sleep. So I think the least amount of sleep I got then was like something like 4 hours. But I do know that we had some members of our class or course who actually they did the opposite. So they like flipped their their sleep wake schedule.
Okay.
And they stayed up all night and came in like totally sleep deprived into the exam room and did the exam. Like, I guess they drank a lot of caffeine, but I mean, they can correct me if I'm wrong afterwards, but I don't think that they did I don't think they were like the top achievers. I mean, like, they were performers in those exams, but I only recall a few of those exams that I don't remember if I don't think they did that throughout the whole program.
Yeah. But so their idea was that if they stayed up later, they could study more, and that would increase their performance, really.
Yeah. I mean, I guess there's some truth to the fact that if you have something in short memory, you can keep it there. But we all know that there are many there's so many detrimental effects also, as you alluded to, on cognition. Yeah, with sleep deprivation, that like I said, I don't think it was worth it.
I agree. Just subjectively, this last week, I actually had like one of the worst weeks of sleep. I think it's partly due to the temperature.
Yeah.
It's keeping me awake, not being able to sleep at night. And what I've noticed this last week is that my memory sometimes I just forget stuff. I forget my keys. Like, it's just horrible, the memory effects.
Yeah.
But what I wanted to ask you about that was, are those cognitive effects, have they been measurably impaired from chronic sleep impairments?
Yeah. So there are studies that look at longitudinal effects, and there are meta-analyses that indicate that you have, on average, worse cognition or cognitive performance if you sleep less. Now, duration is a bit tricky because the problem there, I think, is that like we discussed earlier, that everyone has a subjective sleep duration that works best for them. So if you just divide people into different bins of duration, I think it's hard to capture that, because it's also often you just ask the question once and then you follow them over many years and you try to find an association. But if you instead ask them about a sleep complaint, which could be a marker of insomnia, where they're indicating that they're not getting high quality sleep. And that we also know is very common. We know that insomnia and symptoms of insomnia are very common. Now, if you ask that, you often find a more reliable correlation with, let's say, cognitive impairments over time. And the same goes for neurodegeneration, that if we look at neurodegeneration, we did such a study. I was involved in such a study where we looked at individuals who had subjective complaints of not getting good sleep versus those that had good sleep. And there we reliably saw that the risk of dementia, and specifically or especially Alzheimer's disease, was increased over time. Yeah. So that's also an interesting aspect with sleep, of course, is that we can both look at the objective and the subjective, and how you measure it not only varies a lot, but it can also be very important for how you assess outcomes. And now we, of course, have all these wearables and so on. And so we're seeing these larger and larger studies that actually use subjective data too.
How do they combine? Because I know that like many of these companies that have wearables like Whoop and Aura and so on, like they will have lots of data, right, to analyze. But do they, like in their mobile applications, like prompt the user to answer like, how was your sleep last night? Like how do they gather that subjective data?
Yeah, I'm not actually sure of how Whoop does it, but I haven't had such a device and I haven't reviewed their papers in detail. But yeah, there are combinations of it. Either you can just the clock itself, or the smartwatch, or the device calculates some kind of sleep quality score, or there's sometimes like Sleep Cycle, and I think and other companies that actually ask for sort of input.
Yeah, but you don't have any sleep measurement device yourself.
I do. I wear a Garmin watch. It's not so much for the sleep stuff, because I actually find it, and maybe I shouldn't say this, but I don't find it so reliable. That's pretty common, that and a fact that they are not fully reliable, of course, like that's across the board.
Yeah.
But I use it more for tracking when I do workouts and so on.
Yeah. I actually am happy that you did say that, because I want to hear that perspective as well. Like, I had gotten that idea from you earlier when we spoke, that you weren't sold on these devices and the data that they provide. Do you want to share your perspective on why you don't think they're so reliable?
Well, I'm also just going off of the well, it's both personal and literature. I tried a few devices, and yeah, they of course they're obviously getting better and better, and we know that they can track total sleep time pretty well. It's just based on which is, I mean, if you think about it, it's pretty easy because you're just lying down, being immobile for several hours. So if we just think about it from a sort of measurement perspective, it's kind of easy based on what's going on with your wrist, for example. Right. But we know that, and this has been shown repeatedly in the literature, that calculating other aspects that can be of importance, at least for us, especially for us researchers. It may not matter. They probably shouldn't matter so much for the uh, for people in the general population. So that's why it's also kind of concerning that that we get fed all these metrics, which are regarding the sleep stages and so on. Those are very hard to track. And that's, of course, also logic when you think about it, the fact that normally we would estimate or calculate them by registering your brain activity and other specific motor activity that's been developed over long periods of time, and not by some proprietary algorithm that each company is like trying to tell you is very highly correlational to that sleep metric. So there we know that often it's just not much better than guessing what sleep stage you're in. I'm seeing like there are some companies, they're getting better and better. So there is a high degree of correlation, but still we know that the gold standard for assessing if you want to get information on what sleep stages you're in at a specific time of the night and so on, you need the measurement of your brain activity. So electroencephalography or with the combined set of electrodes or measurements that are part of what we call polysomnography.
Yeah. So sleep stages, you do not believe that they are reliable in these commercially available devices, but how about the physiological measurements such as resting heart rates, respiratory rates, and so on?
I think those can be quite reliably assessed, but again, just personal experience, I've also seen a lot of erroneous measurements. And we know that, let's say heart rate, that the way you move your wrists, how close you attach it to your wrists, is there the color of your skin, um, yeah, all those kinds of things can also impact how well it's actually able to measure it, or accurately it's able to measure it. So for example, I've had runs where I know that my heart rate is pretty close to my like 80, 90% maximum of my heart rate, but my watch was only showing me that I was like at 130 or something. So that's
Oh, yeah. I know what you're saying. I've also had watches showing me, well, clearly erroneous data. So I guess that layer of like, does this make sense intuitively? The data is good to have as well. Yeah. How prevalent is poor sleep quality and quantity in the world we live in today?
So it seems to be quite country dependent, which is interesting. But overall, like there are very good measurements over time. In, for example, the United States, which is obviously it's very diverse in terms of population, and we know that it also differs a bit depending on population and socioeconomic status. But somewhere around 30-40% are not getting enough sleep, and at the higher end, there is where we see complaints being. So the number or the percentage of people who complain about their sleep is somewhere around above 40%. And that's also, if we look at Swedish data, it's actually pretty similar.
Yeah.
So this week we have Folkhälsomyndigheten and the sort of the Swedish CDC, who asks participants or volunteers on a yearly or semi-yearly basis, and then they put out these aggregate numbers, and we can see that that's the proportion of people who do complain about their sleep on a frequent basis is over 40% now. So approaching 50 seems it's a bit higher in women, and it's actually increased over time.
So almost half of the population complain about their sleep.
Yeah.
And then I'd guess maybe 1/3 of that might have a clinical level of sleep.
Yeah, exactly. So the percentage of people who have insomnia, like you indicated, it's definitely much lower. And it also depends on the type of how you define what criteria you use for the diagnosis, because it also differs, it's same in terms of duration, because you should at least have had the symptoms for a month, but according to some criteria, you should have it at least 3 months. But yeah, somewhere around, let's say 8 to 15 or so percent can often be said to suffer from insomnia, depending on the criteria and population you look at.
Yeah. And you mentioned that women have it worse. Why is that?
Well, we don't fully know, and that's something that's being researched, but part of it is thought to be because of the socioeconomic factors, meaning everything from how work life has developed and then the work home life balance. But it could also be that there's a high well, we know that some symptoms are also worsened by hormonal changes. So the fact that women go through menopause also probably can worsen their symptoms.
I see. Yeah. And speaking of hormonal relationships with sleep, what are the effects of sleep deprivation and or impaired sleep quality on hormones regulating appetite?
Yeah, that's a very fascinating area that I'm quite interested in, and it's been known for a bit over 20 years that sleep loss, if you don't sleep enough, we have repeatedly shown, we and others basically, that you get higher levels of the hunger promoting hormone ghrelin. That was shown initially by a seminal study led by F. von Kauder and her team. And you get instead lower levels of the satiety promoting hormone leptin. So ghrelin is a hormone that's secreted from your stomach. And like I said, it promotes hunger. So we say that it's orexigenic. And leptin has the opposite effect and is secreted instead from adipose tissue cells. So it's anorexigenic.
Yeah.
So those are I would say the two most studied hormones, but then there's a bunch of other hormones as well.
Do you want to share? You look excited about it.
Well, I think that there's a lot of hormones that remain to be investigated. For example, we and others have also looked at endocannabinoids, for example, that are also tied to hunger regulation, and as for similar to ghrelin and leptin, we can see disruptions of these hormones in people who are sleep deprived. So
we can.
No, we can't. We can't.
Similar.
We
Yeah,
do.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
I should have. Yeah.
Yeah. In what direction?
So we see in one study, for example, we saw higher levels of one of the endocannabinoids, 2-EG. So acts on basically the reward system, and which can through that pathway promote hunger.
So an upregulation of reward system activity, essentially.
Yeah. So there was even at one point we even had a medication, rimonabant, that was active on that endocannabinoid system, but it had too high of a risk of suicide, so that's when it had to be withdrawn.
Yeah. But this research on cannabinoids and their involvement in the effects of impaired sleep on appetite, that research is still ongoing?
Yeah, there's a very strong, again, another Chicago group that's quite strong, and they've established that another interesting feature of these endocannabinoids, similar to ghrelin and leptin, is that they have a variation across the sleep-wake cycle. And I know that they have been studying that and how that's also disrupted by insufficient sleep. So that's another interesting aspect, is not only does, like, we shouldn't look at these systems at a given moment, but what often happens when you disrupt sleep is that you also disrupt intertwined circadian rhythms.
Yeah.
And that can then, for example, if you think about hunger, you might be promoting hunger at the wrong time of day when, for example, suddenly you're out and next to the supermarket, and now you're more inclined to purchase something that's can give you that high reward.
Yeah. So it's very context dependent. Is that the point you're trying to make?
Yeah, or I think that it's just important to emphasize that we shouldn't just be looking at everything at a single moment. That also the rhythms matter, because that's the circadian rhythms, which are these eternal 24-hour rhythms.
Yeah.
They also impact the hormonal rhythms are very important for our long-term health, basically.
Yeah. And so if we take these three examples of ghrelin, leptin, and endocannabinoids, how would you expect them to, because we measured them at a single moment, right? And we saw that leptin was increased, ghrelin was decreased, and endocannabinoids were increased in activity in these reward circuits. What research questions that haven't been answered, or have they already been answered, would you be interested in that are more focused on the rhythmicity of these substances rather than?
Well, let's say, for example, a group where rhythms are really disrupted a lot is shift workers. And there's some really fascinating work where they have actually exposed individuals to simulated shift work over many days. And what they have also done, I think this is work from Frank Shear and his group, is that they have then tested how these hormones respond. Let's say if you have a meal in the biological morning and evening, and that also shows a similar effect, that these hormonal axes are disrupted.
Yeah.
So normally, for example, let's see, you would reward activity is actually higher in the evening typically.
Okay.
And that
For food, or?
yeah, or I guess that maybe for other things too. Actually, these are reward system is actually more just active in the evening.
Okay.
So, and that maybe have some evolutionary advantage, but if we promote that too much, and let's say we know that calories in the evening are not the best, so that may, and the body may have, basically has a lower ability to deal with those calories. So if you promote that system at that time when we actually should be preparing for, let's say, our rest phase, we know that from studies that is also linked to a higher risk of, for example, developing obesity over time. So that's another part of, let's say, calorie. You asked about how do we need to understand these from the circadian perspective. Well, the calorie intake, more and more research is being done on the timing of, let's say, calorie intake. And for example, dietary regimens as time-restricted eating, where we try to allocate eating only to a specific time window. And there's some evidence there that shows that you can, for example, get a better hunger profile. So your hunger regulation, which is partly probably has to do with the hormones, but maybe also how the brain reward system works. Is, and both the hedonic and the reward system of the brain works, is that when you adopt such a eating regimen, so that you're only eating during specific hours of the day, and most of the evidence seems to point to a benefit of eating early during the day, then you actively, you just passively by doing so, your hunger regulation is improved. So you're actually just by adopting that window, when you're saying I can only eat during these hours, then you will naturally reduce the number of calories you eat. And that's through by improving sort of the regulation of all these hormonal and homeostatic systems that regulate how you sense your energy need versus, let's say, reward.
Right, right. So people who eat earlier also eat less. Observationally, generally.
It's a sort of basically the earlier your timing of food is, they've done studies on this even during weight loss. They see that the earlier the timing of your main meal or main calories are, the better your chances are, for example, of losing weight.
Yeah, yeah.
But then there are other, like, it shouldn't be, I think in some cases it's also taken to an extreme, because we know that most types of time restricted eating, where you're restricting that window of eating to 8 hours or so, has benefits. But again, so I wouldn't say to anyone, oh, you have to stop eating. You can only let's say eat from 8 in the morning to 4 in the afternoon. That's too strict, because we obviously, like we said, we not only do we have individual sleep needs, but we also have that individual chronotype, and also our individual work life schedule, which needs to all come together, right?
Yeah.
So it would be impossible and just frustrating if I told everyone, like, you can only eat from 8 to 4.
Yeah.
Because that may not work. Like, what if you,
Yeah.
So, and indeed, there are studies that they have done also later, time restricted eating windows. So, say around, like, I think one was around, was it like 3 to 7 p.m. or something like that in one of these studies that's published in Cell Metabolism. And they also found that also produced benefits. So even with the later window, you can see benefits.
Benefits on weight or circadian regulation?
It's actually on all of these factors. So weight and metabolic regulation, and and that stems also in part from this lower energy intake.
Yeah. I know that there are, I don't know if there are many people, but I know that there are people for sure who say that they can't fall asleep if they don't eat, like, just before sleep. Do you think they should focus on this? Is it important that they focus on it for their health, or like is this a big deal, or is it like not so much of a?
I think you can view it in different ways. Like, let's say we have an individual who's has problems with their weight, and then we could maybe think about, is there maybe a point, let's say, at least to restricting that window, first of all. Because we know that eating close to bedtime, for example, it basically shuts off your fat oxidation, or at least it probably delays it. They've done studies where they provided a snack close to bedtime, and they saw that lowered the fat oxidation during the night. And so that's one aspect. And if you eat too big of a meal too late, you can actually disrupt your sleep, and that could obviously increase your daytime hunger if your sleep is disrupted. So there may be a vicious cycle there. But on the other hand, like you said, many individuals, for example, you may have a late workout, something that promotes your hunger, or maybe you just had a very long work day and you weren't able to find time for let's say your normal size dinner.
Right.
And then a small meal that might be better for you to be able to fall asleep than going to bed hungry.
Yeah, I've had that actually when I did a really heavy workout. Like, I couldn't fall asleep because I was hungry, and then I ate, and then yeah. So I I see I see that argument as well. So I guess it depends on the person's goals as well. Like, are they trying to lose weight? But also you mentioned that there are circadian effects. So just for general circadian health and sleep regularity, then I guess it would be better to.
Yeah, it might be better. Like, again, I think it needs to be considered on an individual basis. But we also know from other studies that, let's say you do try to let's say you also have problems falling asleep, there are studies that show that if you do try to stop eating at an earlier hour during that evening, that can also it seems to be able to also help you fall asleep earlier, because basically that's instead like shifting your entire eating time to an earlier time point.
If you had a big breakfast, is that what you said?
Well, I think that the study that they did was basically that they tried to shift all the meals to an earlier time.
Yeah.
And then that helped people, because it's also the case, like I indicated, that if you do eat a big meal night, your body needs many time to sort of digest it.
Yeah, right.
Even hard to fall asleep
Right.
if you feel too full.
Yeah. Yeah. And so digestion would require energy that the body couldn't then use for other restorative processes during sleep. Is that the idea?
Yeah, sort of. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. I know that heart rate variability is a popular.
Popular metric from these wearables. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And well, I guess the line of reasoning that is used to argue for its utility is that, well, so the heart rate is regulated by parasympathetic and sympathetic activity, and so if we have a parasympathetic dominance, then the variation between heartbeats is larger, and so the heart rate variability is larger. And on the opposite hand, sympathetic activity would control that heart rate variability into a narrow range. Yeah. What do you think about heart rate variability now?
Well, I think I think it can be interesting, especially from a research perspective, perhaps. But I do think that now there's too much of a focus on it, perhaps for the consumer or the average person, I think.
Yeah.
So I can't recall any like significant major research advance that would say that would lead me to think that we now need to have everyone needs to know their heart rate variability and how it's
Really
affected.
Yeah.
Um,
I think it's used in sports performance sometimes.
yeah. So yeah, in such contests that are more like where there may be a very um targeted and sort of high priority focus to improve through whatever means possible, then that may serve its purpose. Like, and similar to how studies show that you can actually improve performance just by trying to increase time in bed, or essentially the amount that people sleep when they're if they're athletes.
Yeah.
But I do think, for the consumer, that it may be less relevant.
I see.
And also similar to what we discussed earlier, that I would say that these are two reliable measures because the same factors that it suffers from the same type of potential artifacts or measurement errors.
Yeah. Probably depends a lot on, like, if you have an EKG, then probably better reliability.
You say so much better. Yeah.
Yeah, because I know there is data indicating that, like, it's correlated with some chronic diseases and the development of them, but I don't know the sources of those data points.
But it's interesting. So now that you bring it up, and there was a recent study, for example, speaking of like eating, and in this case, it was working out that they looked at close to bedtime, and they did find, based on, they were also looking at heart rate variability. I think that basically, if you do work out at a too high intensity within even up to 4 hours at a very high intensity, that is, within 4 hours of going to bed, they can actually see that basically, like you said, your nervous system is not reaching that really resting point to the same extent as you normally would.
Yeah.
So that's, of course, an interesting, like that is a very interesting research use of that, where we see that we can find evidence of how very intense exercise can actually disrupt parts of your restorative parts of sleep. Now, again, exercise has, well, from the other perspective, exercise has so many benefits. So the question is, and we know that it can improve sleep through total sleep time and so on. So there may still be sort of a, risk benefit balance there.
Yeah.
But yeah, that obviously, I think that may have experienced that if they don't, if they do exercise too late, that if they do it really intensely, that it may be hard to fall asleep even.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I think that was a very good use of those wearables.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember reading one study also on like exposure to cold and seeing that had similar effects. So like late night exposure to cold water immersion led to, well, an increased sympathetic activity as measured by HRV, and then other metrics of sleep quality were also impaired. So similar effects to the high intensity exercise then also impairing sleep quality. Can we summarize the effects of sleep quality and impaired sleep quality on metabolism?
Well, I can speak even more about, let's say, sleep. Well, it depends on how you look at it, but sleep duration, we know that if you don't get enough sleep, that you have a higher risk of developing conditions such as type 2 diabetes and obesity. And part of that is through worsening your insulin sensitivity probably over time. And you also disrupt the function of, for example, skeletal muscle, adipose tissue, and even how your liver works, and your gut, and your gut microbiome. So a lot of different factors, and it's also like this. It's a very interconnected set of phenomena that happens, right? Because you also then, like we discussed earlier, promote, for example, overeating and eating of less healthy foods. And that in turn can worsen your insulin sensitivity and so on.
Right, and that's reduced sleep quantity, right? Yeah. So reduced sleep quantity is terrible for your metabolism. One could summarize it as.
Yeah, and again, we have to then say that now we're talking about someone who's doing this chronically.
Yeah.
Again, with the caveat that everyone has different sleep needs. So.
Yeah, sure.
But I would say that we know, for example, as a risk factor, that not getting enough sleep or having different symptoms of insomnia is as important of a risk factor for developing type 2 diabetes as being physically inactive. And we know how we always get, these, everyone is like always emphasizing, repeating how not enough people are meeting these recommendations.
Yeah.
But yeah, sleep is just as important, basically. Right. And also, and that from that perspective, you can even say that sleep is even more important for some regards, because it also helps keep you motivated for doing all those healthy behaviors.
Right.
Such as eating right and exercising.
Yeah. Could you speak about the mechanisms of that? Like, how does enough sleep, and maybe even if you know anything about the sleep architecture or the sleep quality, how do these factors influence, like, maybe reward circuitry in the brain that in turn result in increased motivation for health promoting behaviors?
Yeah, so part of what happens when you don't sleep enough is that you have a harder time regulating your inhibitions, and also your emotional reactivity changes.
Mm.
You can basically get too high at emotional reactivity, which, let's say, similar to that, what you may have experienced in regular life is that just becomes like you think that everything is harder than it normally is.
Right.
Like whatever someone says, you may overanalyze it or not interpret it correctly. And with that, in what I mentioned about inhibition, that's one aspect that we know, again, is not functioning optimally, is your, let's say, ability to resist things that are providing immediate rewards like food versus your ability to plan because is less is not functioning at the same level because your prefrontal cortex that is not working at as well. And for that, we know that, for example, REM sleep is very important. And if you cut back on your sleep, let's say you're only suddenly sleeping like 5.5 instead of 8 hours, you're losing a lot of that REM sleep that occurs late at night. And that we know is very important for regulating your emotions, right?
Yeah. And so that's the acute negative effects on impulse inhibition, emotional reactivity of sleep deprivation and sleep architecture, for example, REM sleep reduction. So are there any chronic effects that there is evidence for? Well, if you have chronic sleep deprivation or chronic REM sleep deprivation, for example.
Yeah. So chronically, we also know, so related more to, let's say, mood and emotions and so on. And just thinking back to, because you mentioned that we were talking about REM sleep, then we know that that's also important for the risk of conditions such as depression. And in depression, there's often a disrupted sleep regulation.
Yeah.
They actually, their REM sleep regulation is altered. And therapeutic effects there are actually, it's kind of complicated, but you can basically measure it by how much you impact REM sleep.
Antidepressants?
Yeah. So someone who's chronically sleep deprived, they have a higher risk of these, thinking back to the sort of neuropsychological state, then where we have the acute effects of difficulty regulating emotions and so on, but chronically that translates to a higher risk of depression in people who don't get enough sleep or who have insomnia. And in showing how interconnected it is, a lot of these psychiatric disorders also often involve disrupted sleep and the sort of sub-symptom, or even as a trigger. Like we know that manic disorders can be triggered by insufficient sleep or at least disrupted circadian rhythms.
Yeah. And then in turn, many of these psychological or psychiatric disorders could lead to sleep disruptions in themselves, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, another example where it's bidirectional.
Right. Yeah. I know that you've also co-authored papers on, I'm not sure whether you co-authored papers on the role of the gut microbiome in the relationship between sleep and psychiatric disorders, or
Yeah, I was
you did?
did.
Yeah.
I was involved in that, but
Yeah. So do
got it at the top of my head.
okay. Because I wanted to transition to the effect of sleep on the gut microbiome and the role of the gut microbiome in regulating sleep and what we know about that. And so if I tell you like particular bacteria, do you think that
No, not at the top of my head.
No, okay.
Yeah.
But so do you want to speak to it generally then? What do we know about the effects of sleep impairments in quantity or quality on the gut microbiome?
Yeah, so there have been, now we've seen quite a number of studies that have looked at various types of how variation in sleep, in duration, and also in some cases in patients, how that is correlated with changes in the gut microbiome. And we also did a study where we had participants in the lab, so we were able to, because it was one of those randomized control studies. So we the only thing that varied between the two conditions was the amount of sleep that the participants got, and that's how we were more directly able to show that if healthy people don't get enough sleep, you can also change their gut microbiome.
Yeah.
And this was after 3 nights of either getting 4.25 hours or 4 hours 15 minutes of sleep, or 8.5 hours of sleep.
Right.
So, and they got the same food, so it wasn't anything. Though they weren't allowed to eat whatever they wanted, basically, the only thing that varied between the two conditions was the amount of sleep that they got.
Yeah.
And what we saw then was that when they did not get enough sleep, the changes in the microbiome were similar to those that have been observed in some studies of people with, for example, obesity and type 2 diabetes, when those are compared with healthy or individuals without those conditions.
Yeah.
And there was actually, just now I saw today that there's even a meta-analysis that's now out that's looked at both, because people have also done similar studies or much more, advanced studies in rodents. And like I mentioned, there have also been more human studies, and overall those showed that there seemed to be an overall effect on this ratio that we studied, the Firmicutes bacteroides.
So you know the specific bacteria. I was actually going to ask you about that.
Yeah, so that's, again, I would say that, first of all, like, one caveat to this all research is I think that it's still in an early stage. Yeah. It's, in some sense, it's like wearables, where it's a bit hype, that we can find a lot of correlations, and I think that functionally we don't know what all these changes mean and how they translate to, for example, disease risk and so on.
Right.
But in this case, what's my understanding of it is that a higher ratio of Firmicutes, for example, would potentially enable the organism, in this case a human, to be able to extract more energy, which would then be consistent in, or potentially, let's say, be one of the mechanisms by which individuals could then more easily gain weight if they don't sleep enough.
So extract more energy. So the organism you refer to is the human in this case, for example.
Yeah.
And when you say they can extract more energy if they have more of this Firmicutes to bacteroidetes ratio.
Yeah.
Like, what do you mean we can extract more energy?
So actually, like, the gut microbes, they help us to break down certain nutrients, and especially in the lower part of the intestine, they can help us extract certain nutrients that, so they are essential for us to absorb short-chain fatty acids, some of which they have potential benefits for us. But my understanding is that these specific bacteria could potentially help us extract more of that energy that is seen in the lumen of the gut.
Mm-hmm.
So again, like, I don't know exactly how those effects are, but I know that one way that this has been studied in rodents is because you can make rodents germ-free by keeping them sterile and providing them with antibiotics. And then you can see how you can, for example, protect animals from diet-induced obesity by taking away their gut microbes.
Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, that's a very different scenario, and completely, like, you're wiping out this whole massive community. Yeah. But it just shows how important these microbes are for enabling an organism to extract energy from the food that we eat.
Right. And so in this example of the Firmicutes ratio, it would be that we would absorb more energy, which would also be in the direction of leading to overweight and obesity.
That's my understanding. And like, again, I don't know, I can't cite the specific underlying study, but that's what I understood.
Yeah. And so all the arrows as regards the mechanistic research on the effects of sleep deprivation and sleep quality impairments on overweight and obesity all point in the direction of, well, it increases caloric intake, it decreases the physical. I don't know if you mentioned this already, but I read it in your research. It decreases the physical expenditure of energy in the morning. It decreases the energy expenditure of breaking down foods, like the mechanical, or is it mechanical, but the diet-induced thermogenesis, right?
Yeah, exactly. So that's like, right. Yeah. So the way that the body breaks down and produces heat from the food, which is part of a process of how the body regulates its energy homeostasis.
Right. Yeah. So essentially, if one is trying to either keep their weight neutral or reduce their weight, then protecting the sleep that they do have is pretty important.
Yeah.
And I know also that you've done research on sleep length, sleep duration increasing interventions, and seen that they do effectively facilitate people's efforts to reduce their weight.
Yeah. So I haven't done that research myself, but I've been speaking about it and trying. Yeah, and that's fascinating research. So that's an area that I think is evolving, and where we'll hopefully see even more research over the years. So, given that we have so many who don't sleep enough, there's of course a great need to understand how can we make people on average sleep longer, and especially those who may be at higher risk, for example, or who have already sort of suffered the adverse effects of insufficient sleep. Let's say someone with overweight, obesity may have developed, in part, that body weight through that excessive body weight through not sleeping enough. That may be part of their mechanism. And there we have seen studies where when they try to extend sleep, that can actually promote, if they achieve that sleep extension, which is feasible for many, then they can lower their energy intake a quite substantial amount. So in one study that I think is the largest study, they lowered their energy intake by over 200 calories compared to the control group that was simply maintaining their insufficient sleep duration. So they were sleeping about, I think, before they went into the intervention, they all had less than 6.5 hours sleep. So that counted as insufficient sleep. And then they were aiming to get above 8. They got sort of above 8 hours of sleep.
Right.
It's a goal. And yeah, so it was only a 2-week intervention in that study. But it's pretty remarkable result, of course. That's very encouraging for people who may be struggling with their weight and want to use lifestyle. And then we, of course, have not only diet and physical activity, but also, as we point out now, sleep as a factor that you can try to improve and then potentially achieve quite meaningful results over time.
Does this connect back to you mentioned the prefrontal cortex effects of having enough sleep and the impulse inhibition? Maybe there's less of this binge eating type of behavior when...
Yeah, partially, probably the prefrontal cortex, the reward system, those may be better regulated, and in turn, the hormonal levels, it may also be that they sense the hormonal levels better.
Right.
So probably a lot of a synergy of those mechanisms.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah.
And there have also been other encouraging results that show that you can improve the cardiometabolic risk factors. So just by basically increasing sleep duration less than 40 minutes over a 6-week intervention period, people who had pre-hypertension, so they were at risk of developing hypertension, they lowered their blood pressure, both their systolic and their diastolic blood pressure. by or about the same magnitude as if they had undergone an exercise intervention. So that's quite meaningful.
By increasing their sleep by how much?
By less than, I think they achieved about 35 minutes. The goal was higher, but typically they don't achieve the full goal. So the average was about 35 minutes more.
Yeah. I know there's been observational data on people who are overweight. I want to find the specific numbers. So people who sleep less than 6 hours, in that group in the study, 31.3% of them had obesity. But in people who slept more than 9 hours, 38% of those people had obesity. So in this instance, it seems like more sleep, like at a first glance, it would seem like more sleep is actually not better for having a lower weight. But yeah, so do you want to explain why do you think this is?
That's like, yeah, it's very important that it's great that you're bringing that up, because we often see that there's a U-shape association. So somewhere around the evidence, it depends on the outcome in the study population and so on. And again, the recommendation is 7 to 9 hours for adults, but for many outcomes, the optimal, or in some studies, basically, the lowest risk of an outcome may be somewhere between 7 to 8 hours.
Mm-hmm.
And then, like you point out, you may start seeing an increased risk of a certain, or association at least, pointing to an increased risk of certain outcome if you sleep, let's say, more than 9 hours. And that is probably multifactorial. Like, if we think about it from an energy balance perspective, if you sleep too much, you may have less time to be physically active. So you may be taking away part of that time when you would expend energy to just sleeping inside. But what we know from studies is that many individuals, if you look at that group of individuals who report sleeping more than 9 hours, typically they do, like in this instance, they do encompass people who have, let's say, disease. And one of the ways that the body tries to, let's say, counteract or recover from disease is by promoting more sleep. So sleep is a recovery mechanism, but that can also sort of taint that. If we look at those curves where we see that in the group of people who sleep more than 9 hours, that why is that associated with worse outcomes?
Yeah. So it could be that they sleep that much because they have they have this load of recovery needs from different factors.
Yeah, it could, for example, obesity can be associated with increased inflammation, and that can promote, that inflammation is actually a really interesting and important trigger of sleep.
Yeah, let's talk about that. Yeah, so IL-6, TNF alpha.
Right. Yeah, those are some of the canonical of these sort of inflammatory proteins, pro-inflammatory proteins.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's why during like, if you just think about it, when you've had the flu or so, you just want to sleep. And that's, so the body responds to this increase in inflammation by trying to promote sleep, which is of course, a way of recovering and keeping you still so that you don't run around and sort of damage all the organs.
Yeah.
Or including, let's say, the heart. Yeah, there would be potential consequences if you did run around. So it's good to try to keep you in a rested phase by making you feel ill and also promoting sleep, which can help with recovery. But that's also a period when your body is then able to sort of activate certain parts of the immune system that is then trying to fight that organism.
Right. And these inflammatory markers are part of that immune response.
Yeah, well, let's say that, right, that they can be different inflammatory markers depending on the condition. But yeah, there have been some, like, interleukins, IL-1, TNF-alpha and so on that have been identified that can directly, by acting on the brain, they can promote sleep.
Right. And I wanted to ask you about that, and I wanted to get like an overview of, well, let's take one day where a person doesn't exercise and one day where a person does exercise. How would the rhythm of these markers change throughout the body, like systemically, and also in the brain, I guess?
That's a good question. I haven't seen exactly that setup, but it would be really interesting to maybe someone has done it. I can't recall at the top of my head say where they sort of switch on and off. But like you point out, these are also part of what's known as sort of exocrine. So like IL-6
Yeah.
also is thought to mediate a lot of the benefits of exercise. So exercise is sort of the immediate sort of after effect is a pro-inflammatory state, but then in the long run, it actually decreases inflammation.
Right.
So that's a complex,
Right.
sort of two-pronged, there are two different ways that inflammation can act there.
Right. So it increases as response, like as an acute response to exercise.
Yeah.
IL-6, for example, then. And then it decreases as we get some rest after. And as I understand it, it also is involved in sleep regulation.
Yeah.
In the sense that when it is higher, we tend to stay asleep more and deeper. So is it that do we sleep until we don't have any more inflammation to clear, or like how does it work?
That's a good question. Well, again, it does regulate sleep. So and yeah, I think that's part of the reasoning why we can see an increase in sleep duration when we have these pro-inflammatory state is that we have more of that signaling going on that is then promoting sleep. And yeah, you could say that the body's trying to resolve it by sleeping more.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah, I learned this in doing research for this podcast, and I didn't know it before, and it was very interesting, I think.
Yeah.
We were talking about the gut microbiome, sleep, and how sleep impairments can lead to changes in the gut microbiome, which in turn impact how much energy we take up in the gut or in the colon, I guess, is more appropriate of a description. But how about the other direction? So the effects of variations of the gut microbes that we have in our guts on sleep quality or quantity.
Oh, yeah, that's I think that's something that needs to be explored more. But I can't really speak to that much.
I see. I read the study on Lactobacillus passeri. Do you know which study I'm talking about?
I think I know, but I don't recall the.
Yeah. It was like med students for 6 months taking the supplements, and it was shown that they had deeper slow wave sleep than those who didn't take the supplement. And this was during exam period, and so this got me like interested and like maybe I should do this because I have exam periods and they tend to not be associated with the best sleep of my life either. So yeah.
Well, was that a placebo controlled study?
I'm not sure whether it was placebo controlled. It was controlled.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I would hope that it was one of those double blinded studies. Because otherwise you would risk that there was basically, yeah, that there was a placebo effect of that.
That's true. So I want to move on to these circadian clocks that we have. We have mentioned the suprachiasmatic nucleus, and we also have cellular clocks, right? Do you want to give a description of both of these clocks and differentiate between the two?
Yeah, so basically all mammals have a system or a hierarchical system, an organization of how clocks are organized from, we could say, the brain to periphery. So in the brain, we have the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which, as the name indicates, it sits just above where the optic nerves cross. So it's deep in the brain, and that is so it exists in all mammals, and we can study it in mice, which is what many people have done to understand its inputs and outputs and so on, and what hormones that are involved and so on, how it signals, when it's active. And that then in turn signals to other sort of circadian clocks in the brain that have other functions. And then that in turn goes also from the SCN and these other clocks in the brain signals to other parts of the body, such as different tissue clocks. And the interesting thing here is that the suprachiasmatic nucleus, so these two nuclei, so some say suprachiasmatic nuclei because
Yeah, right, makes sense. Yeah.
so they can run on their own. If we take them out in a dish, they're so strong, they're so tightly, they're such a perfect clock system that you can take them out and put them in a dish and monitor them, and they can go on for days and days. They have this 24-hour circa. That's why it's called circadian, because it's circa 24 hours, so it's circa about a day.
Right.
And so in Swedish, actually, which is just inside, but people mistranslate, or that they often use an incorrect form of that word. So it should be circadiansk, but sometimes they circadisk is not the right.
And I see. Yeah.
Because then you just cut the last part of the word.
Right. So the etymology doesn't follow along in the.
Yeah. But anyway, so those are really fascinating. Those neurons that can run on their own, and that is the master pacemaker, we say. So it's the SCN, the suprachiasmatic nucleus, abbreviated the SCN, is that master timekeeping unit in your body.
And it's primarily regulated in turn by the light that hits the retina.
Yeah, exactly. So there are these specific cells that we have in our eyes, in our retina, that respond most strongly to blue enriched, that blue wavelength of light. And so that they discovered that was the case by, for example, individuals who can be blind, who don't actually see anything. They don't form images, but they're still able to maintain a normal sleep-wake cycle. So what do I mean by that? But if you take if you take out the eyes and you don't have any light input at all, you will now start drifting according to your internal clock. And unless you have really strong social cues, you may day by day drift according to that rhythm. And that the fact is that each of us, on average, we have an internal rhythm that's longer than 24 hours.
Why is that?
No one really knows that. Mice have shorter rhythms. So it's something about how the network of these clocks, these genetic components work.
Right. And it's because it's faster than, because like with the passing of the year, like the seasons, the day length shifts, right?
Yeah.
But it's something like 27 hours per day at this clock, isn't it?
No. So it's actually the average is like 25.1. Sorry, 24. I hope I said 24. 24.1.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's only like, it's about like, or 24.2. So it's like 12 minutes on average. Yeah. And it's a bit, what's fascinating is that this is work done by Charles Czeisler at Harvard, and he and his team have shown that there are sex differences. So women have on average a bit shorter internal rhythms, so it doesn't run as long, and men have a bit longer. And that may be why, on average, women have a preference to, let's say, have an earlier chronotype, so that they like to go to bed and wake up earlier than men.
Yeah.
But again, this is something that's very specific, and that's also important to acknowledge in society,
Right.
that this internal timing system that in part builds on this setup, these oscillators, as we call them, body clocks, is very individually specific. And that means that we should also like try to encourage workplaces and so on that allow you to wake up at your when you function best and so on. Yeah.
Can you elaborate on that? Like, what are the top policy changes that you'd like to see happen in society?
Wow. Yeah, that's a good so in terms of just focusing now on the sort of sleep health.
Yeah, focusing on sleep. Indeed, yeah.
They don't have anything else revolutionary, I promise. But I think, yeah, because regularity, consistency, which really is all about keeping your circadian clock healthy and happy. I think that's such an essential key. So I think that one of the top things that I would put there is to have more like flexibility in terms of how we allow people to work and also function in school. Like, I mean, I know that in the US, there's been this big push, which has been great, that they wanted school kids to start later. And I think that there was especially needed there because a lot of schools did start very early. And the problem was especially for teenagers, because that's a time of your life when you have a very late chronotype. So your preference is naturally such that you will want to go to bed very late and wake up very late. And if you then force those kids in their teenage years to wake up earlier, we know that that is causing them to suffer in school, performance-wise and mood-wise and so on. So they have shown that if you make that school start time later, they will actually get better sleep, better performance. They will have better, better mood regulation, basically.
Yeah.
And so I think that allowing that on a society-wide basis, actually, we would actually have to teach people, why is this necessary? Because a lot of people don't understand. Like, still, I hear it everywhere. I'm not blaming anyone specific, but I just hear it everywhere I go. Like, people think that you're lazy if you wake up late.
Right.
That's not the case, because again, there's such a variability there that that we just have to accept the fact that we're very different also in terms of sleep time, and it's not healthy for people to be forced to wake up earlier.
Right.
Then they would have to, and likewise, of course, there are people who just want to wake up really early, and that should also be. It would be great if just society, work hours, and so on did allow that flexibility. And I think we saw a bit of that in some indicators. We saw a bit of that, and a lot of people expressed that during the pandemic, when we had a lot more flexible hours, people were allowed to work more from home, and then they didn't have that commuting time, for example, which we know can cut into sleep.
Yeah.
So that's one of the things that and related to that, then I think that allowing people, for example, to work from home, because it can, like I just mentioned, reduce like time that's needed for commuting, for example.
Right.
I think that there's that could also be of great benefit.
Yeah.
And then I think that more workplaces should also think about the lighting system, or everywhere that we should think about the lighting system, because we know that we haven't talked about it, but we mentioned that the circadian system, the suprachiasmatic nucleus, it responds really strong, like the main cue that tells it every day that this is the time that your body should be waking up, and this is the time when these processes should be activated. It likes to keep those very regular, and the best way of doing that is through that really strong light. And that means that we should have environments that allow us to have very strong light in the morning, during the day, and then at night we should have environments that instead dim light and maybe potentially shifted towards away from the blue spectrum, part of the spectrum, and more towards the red, which we know interferes less with that circadian system by not blocking the release of melatonin. That is that night hormone that helps us fall asleep at the right time.
Right, right. And I guess it would still depend on the context. So, for example, people driving cars at night, they would probably still want to have, like, people who are shift workers, for example, they want to be awake during the night. Like,
Yeah.
they have to be. And so, of course, banning blue light is probably not going to be a good solution, but
Yeah. So again, it needs to be very context specific. But that's another point that you bring up there, that I think that and the EU has, of course, worked a lot in this direction, that they're trying to, if you do work shift, carry out shift work, that then you should be allowed to recover. And we know from studies that the longer, let's say, even though we know that shift work is detrimental for, let's say, brain health, they've also shown that if you get enough time to recover, that you can reduce or almost recover fully from those effects. So, and there are other studies that show that the more, let's say, recovery sleep and so on you get, that can also help your different physiological systems and cognition to recover.
Right. Yeah. So many of the negative effects of shift working can be mitigated by recovery sleep, but not all of them.
Yeah.
Which effects couldn't be mitigated?
Well, I think it's actually not fully established which of them are, but let's say that you do develop obesity, apart from taking these newer drugs, it's which don't help permanently either. Like, you have to be on them, but we know that once you have developed that we call it set point, that the cells of your body are now sort of have the instruction that this is the weight that I need to maintain.
Right.
That's very hard. Like, it's very hard to get lose that excessive body weight.
Yeah.
So that's something that can be hard to reverse. And then similarly with, even though we know that, I mean, I would assume so. Let's say that you have someone who's developed cardiovascular disease. At this point, at least, many of them are like that. Can be a permanent change that you may need to be on. If you develop hypertension, you may need to be on lifelong medication.
Yeah.
From that point on, and it may have been that the years of shift work that you had prior to that were increasing the risk. I mean, again, it's a risk increase, and all the other factors that you also do in your life factor into that. But
what would be a metabolically optimized shift working routine from your perspective, if one had to do it?
Yeah, so there's actually some really fascinating research, again, from Frank Shear and his group, that have looked at this, because we know that thinking back to this circadian clock that determines so much of our health, it's actually another thing that I would like to see a part of society is just people understanding that we actually have these clock systems and how they work. But anyway, that they are really important for all aspects of health, and they are what's fascinating. It's both fascinating, of course, from an evolutionary perspective, but it's also kind of can be frustrating, is that they're very slow to shift. I mean, it's mostly a good thing, because that means that it can allocate, let's say, the time of day when it thinks that we're going to be needing to break down energy and absorb into fat and so on. But anyway, that's the background for why, for a shift worker, it's not good for them in general to eat during the night. They're up, they're working, so they may feel that they need that energy, again, possibly because they're activating the reward system because they're sleep deprived and they're being exposed to food at the wrong time of day, potentially.
Yeah.
So we know that shift work is associated also from possibly through those mechanisms for an increased risk of developing obesity and metabolic syndrome. But if we did an optimal schedule, it would probably be to not eat that much during the night time. So There was a pretty recent study that instead showed that actually it might be even better for a shift worker to not eat at all during the night when they're working, because that's the biological night when our system is adapted to be in a rest state, also metabolically.
Yeah.
But instead, even though they would sleep during the day, they could wake up during the day and eat their meals then.
Yeah.
So they would eat, of course, the breakfast when they got home from the shift, because that's their natural breakfast time. But then they would also possibly wake up during that sleep period, eat, and then they would eat before they go on their shift again, before it's night. Yeah. And that may be better for metabolism. And that just shows us how the circadian system, again, the fact that it likes to stay on a fixed schedule. It doesn't shift so fast.
Yeah. Right. And how about caffeine?
Yeah. So I think that caffeine can definitely, we know that there are some notable accidents. We have traffic accidents and so on that occur when people are not, that they're too sleep deprived. And we know that caffeine can help offset some of those effects. So I think that it has its role, of course, but you have to just be mindful of not drinking it too close to, or tapering down as you get close to when you're supposed to sleep.
Right.
Because in general, we know that already without caffeine, sleep, when you suddenly have to sleep during the day, because that sleep is now shifted, again, indicating how, because the fact that it's so hard to shift those circadian rhythms quickly, that sleep is not going to be as good as your normal nighttime sleep. If you have a shift worker, and let's say they suddenly had to work during the night, they're up all night, that would normally be their sleep time. And then they're forced to sleep during the day instead.
Yeah.
But that sleep is not going to be as good, because this sleep itself also relies on our circadian timing. So at night, when normally you have a rhythm in our body temperature, for example, that it has its minimum early or late at night, close to the early morning. And that is tied to when we have the highest ability to enter REM sleep, that important sleep stage that actually also regulates blood glucose, and our emotional reactivity, memory aspects, and so on.
Yeah.
And so when we shift our sleep,
Right.
we may be sleeping at a time when our body temperature, for example, is higher. We are still able to we will still get that really deep sleep, because deep sleep, that builds up. The more we're awake, the more we have that sleep pressure. So we build that up. But we will, for example, not enter REM sleep in the same way. So we will have a different, more shallow, more disrupted sleep if we suddenly sleep at the wrong time of day.
Right. Right. And maybe then caffeine can help offset some of those effects on emotional reactivity or impulse inhibition.
Yeah, so caffeine can offset some of the effects, but not all. So I know that the U.S. military they've been working endlessly to try and find some kind of drug that can offset all the negative effects of sleep loss, but there's no such cure, basically.
I see. Yeah. Yeah. I want to move on to the effects of sleep impairments on architecture or quantity on exercise and the results of exercise. So when it comes to aerobic performance, so people who do aerobic exercise, meaning more long distance running or bicycling or swimming, if they have identical training schedules and diets, let's say, how large of an effect let's take the example of 4.25 hours of sleep versus 8.5 hours. How large of an effect would you expect that would have?
I think part of the effect is, like we discussed earlier, that there's a motivational effect, that you may not be motivated how you may you may feel that you just lack the energy to work out.
Right.
We actually did that type of study where we had participants do a quite intense bout of exercise after both 8.5 hours sleep and 4.25 hours, 4 hours, 50 minutes of sleep.
Yeah. Right.
And so they had those conditions for 3 nights in a row. So they were pretty sleep deprived, but they were still able to perform the same workout session, which was, again, at that high level. But we were, of course, like motivating them, and like it was, they knew that it was part of the study.
Yeah. So it was 30 minutes of 75% of their VO2 max, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so 30 minutes. So that's quite long at a very high intensity.
Yeah.
But I know that other studies have shown that, yeah, you can see lower muscle performance. But again, the extent to which that involves like motivational aspects and so on might be hard too, because the body also has like these means to protect itself. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Right. Because what you did find in that study was that this cardiac muscle, cardiac muscle cell death marker was increased in the blood, right? Troponin T.
So troponin, we did find higher levels of the cardiac troponin isoform. Now that is, it's not, it doesn't mean that cells necessarily that the heart lost cells, that there was death, because they've actually, it's more of a marker of the full like role of release of cardiac troponin after exercise is not fully known. It does correlate with some adverse parameters of your cardiovascular system, but it's quite weak. And so it may just indicate it's more of a stress marker, I would say, that you're activating that your cardiac cells are now under maybe more stress, that the threshold to induce stress was lower after the participant hadn't slept enough.
Right.
So, and we know from many other organ systems that if you don't sleep enough, cells are more vulnerable, like at a higher, that they are under more, let's say, basal stress.
Yeah.
So we can only speculate what this means in the long run, but we at the same time, it's also important to note that exercise is able to offset some of the deleterious effects of sleep loss. And as you look at both in some experimental studies, and also if you look at some epidemiological evidence. But again, not all of them. So there are some effects that even if you work out at a very high level, sleep, not getting enough sleep has some adverse effects or is associated with an increased risk of certain outcomes that cannot be fully offset by just exercising more.
Yeah. Yeah. So we should not interpret this finding then as that it is okay to not work out after having a 4 night sleep.
Yeah, I would say that you can probably still work out, but maybe you should just also from an injury perspective, because again, with all the it having sleep loss having effects on cognition and everything else, I would say that from many perspectives, it's probably just better to do it at a maybe lower intensity.
Right. Yeah. That's what I was thinking. Would you recommend that?
Yeah, I would. Me myself, I would. That's also probably what I would do. I would do that. I have a hard time, staying away from working out. So, and we know that, like, just like caffeine, it can increase your energy levels afterwards. So, and there are also experimental, quite elegant work that shows that, for example, metabolism that is, not working as well. Let's say glucose metabolism is not working as well after you don't get enough sleep. But in participants who also exercise during that time of sleep restriction,
Right.
you can actually restore that back to like it's approaching a normal level.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I get that there are benefits of doing low intensity exercise after sleep restriction, reduced quantity of sleep. Would you say that the evidence that does exist is enough to be restrictive with the high intensity exercise? Like, of course, people aren't going to feel like they want to do that after a night of sleep restriction, but do you think that it would actually be bad for people to do it?
I don't think we can say that with the evidence we have right now. But yeah, I would be worried about the risk of injury, that because we know that is increased and if you don't get enough sleep.
Right. Probably depends on the complexity of the sport as well, right? So doing like spinning and bicycling, maybe that's a bit easier to do high intensity when you're sleep deprived, perhaps. Yeah.
But going back to those, sort of policy changes or so on, I would also, it may be just good to have sort of an almost simply a recommendation saying that like exercise is not a substitute for sleep. How there's sort of this trend that I still see it when I like look through social media at times, that people still seem to think that, if you get up just really early and work out instead of sleeping, that somehow is like the ultimate best lifestyle.
Yeah.
But again, then I think we're ignoring.
Right. So people take caffeine and work out and like listen to that part of the evidence, but don't really listen to the actual other side of it. Yeah.
And especially from like the recovery aspects of sleep, that it's so like that's when during deep sleep we have high secretion of growth hormones. So all of those recovery aspects should not be ignored.
Right. Right. Yeah. It also comes to this question of like what we value in our culture, right? Like whether it's health or productivity that's more important in the short term. Yeah. And whether people value their long-term health versus long-term productivity and so on.
Yeah, that's actually a very good point you bring up there, because I think that, now what everyone talks or has been talking a lot about is on a societal level, what they want to change is to bring it down to, let's say, either like a 4-day work week or like a 6-hour work week. And I do think that there could be benefits to that, just how it trickles down to what happens with sleep, because if you don't have to be as much as work, again, like we discussed earlier, maybe you get more time for sleep naturally.
Yeah.
But I think that another way of viewing that could also just be, you could also take it from the sleep perspective and say, how do we ensure that everyone gets as much sleep as they need? Not just thinking about the work hours.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Maybe the negative effects on productivity wouldn't even be that large if the quality of the work would be not as impaired as it currently is by all the sleep deprivation that people experience. Because 50% of people complaining about their sleep is quite a lot.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so continuing with the effects on exercise outcomes of sleep deprivation. From a long-term adaptation perspective, how might chronic sleep restriction affect the VO2 max trajectory in people who do, either aerobic exercise, high-intensity interval training, or both?
Oh, that's a great question. I actually don't even know the answer to that. Yeah, I haven't even looked at that study, but I do need to read up on that.
Yeah, I see. Yeah. Well, I asked an AI about it, and the answer I got was that multiple studies show chronic sleep loss reduces cardiovascular efficiency, blunts training response, and increases perceived exertion. So that speaks to the point that you mentioned as well, with perceived exertion being higher. And so, well, in a realistic setting, I guess that a likely scenario for how VO2 to max trajectory might not be as good for athletes doing who are chronically sleep deprived, would be that maybe they're just not going to be like on the top of their game mentally and like actually train as well that they would have had they had better sleep. That's a plausible mechanism, I think.
And studies, sleep loss is basically, we could think of it as sort of a catabolic state. So, and catabolic from a bad perspective, which means that studies from us and others have shown that basically it has detrimental effects on muscle integrity. And you see that, and that's also supported by animal studies. So basically maintenance of muscle is impaired if you don't sleep enough. And that has also been shown by an association in older individuals that if you don't get enough sleep, you have a high risk of not only having obesity, but also having sarcopenia. So it also correlates with less muscle mass, which we know is so important for as you age for your overall mortality risk and so on.
Right.
So, and yeah, in our study where we simulated sort of shift work, we found that does indeed seem to promote these sort of pro-inflammatory and sort of negative effects on muscle in terms of maintaining muscle mass. Mm-hmm. But yeah, and you can also see from, even if you lose weight, and this is also quite relevant today when we talk about these GLP-1 agonists, that there's a big question is, and there's some new exciting strategies that are out there for preventing the loss of muscle mass as you lose weight, because you want to lose your excessive adipose tissue, not muscle mass. Yeah. And what researchers showed in an earlier study was that when individuals try to lose weight, they didn't sleep enough, they actually lost less fat mass, but they instead lost more muscle mass than when they were sleeping a normal amount. So that just also supports the notion that enough sleep is really important for maintaining muscle, which is part of all that, how well you can carry out exercise.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And so it not only increases the risk for overweight and obesity, but it also increases, like at a more mechanistic or at more of a tissue level, it shifts the balance between muscle and fat growth, so as to promote fat growth and really promote the breakdown of muscle.
Essentially.
Yeah. Do you know if there are any effects of sleep loss on, and still then connected to exercise, perhaps red blood cell production or hematocrit levels?
Oh, that's a great question. And it's actually funny that you say that because, well, I haven't read up on it, but I wanted to read up on it. I know. Because what we do know, I know that there's work to show that, well, the whole like the blood cell lineage, those are quite affected by sleep, both at, in terms of what cells are circulating at a given time, what types of markers there are inflammatory versus anti-inflammatory markers they're secreting. So that's been quite well studied because especially I know from the perspective of immunity, but I don't know specifically how the hematocrit is affected, I suppose. Yeah.
And how were those other blood cells affected?
Well, so for example, in people who are exposed to stimulated or just overnight wakefulness, so simulated night shift, their neutrophils are they're sort of less functional. Yeah, and those are, of course, important for taking care of bacterial infections, for example. Yeah.
So increased susceptibility for such infections.
Yeah. And we know that So if you look at individuals, I even actually wrote a short commentary about this during the pandemic because I was worried that the healthcare personnel, because they were quite exposed, that they weren't going to get enough sleep before a vaccine was available. And there is prior data to show, like you said, that basically if you have worse sleep, you have a higher risk of getting, for example, pneumonia. In quite elegant studies, they have also even tested how susceptible you are to the common cold. So those are called like these inoculation studies. And you can then divide people into how long they slept before they went into the lab to be inoculated with the virus. And then researchers have shown that, if in individuals that sleep less than 7 hours, the risk is far higher. And especially also if they have really inefficient sleep, so they're just, basically lying in bed but not getting sleep, then their risk of infections is also much higher than for people who have good or enough sleep.
All right, so this may be a bit of a niche topic, but I wanted to ask you about microRNAs and how microRNA 127.3p and 142.3p, they're apparently increased in plasma after one night of wakefulness. And I wanted to get your thoughts on what some potential future applications of microRNAs for maybe diagnosis or finding people who are particularly vulnerable to the effects of sleep restriction or for treatment purposes.
Yeah. So microRNAs are these really short stretches of these, RNA, basically, that so they act on our genome and they can circulate. And that's how we measure them in one of our studies, is that we took blood from healthy individuals after one night of sleep loss and compared that to the same participants and their blood after one night of normal sleep. And so that was basically a model of simulating shift work. And we found that these 2 out of 3 microRNAs that we measured that had previously been associated with neurodegenerative disease were implicated in neurodegenerative disease, particularly Alzheimer's disease. We found that 2 of these microRNAs were circulating at higher levels after the participants had been up all night, basically. And we've thought that was interesting because similar increases in microRNAs have been noted in neurodegeneration. And we know that sleep loss, chronic sleep loss, and chronically impaired sleep, disrupted sleep, as we discussed earlier, is associated with an increased risk of neurodegeneration, such as Alzheimer's disease, but also other actually neurodegenerative diseases, such as multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's disease, and just dementia in general. And of course, cognitive decline. So, how do these microRNAs work? Well, what's fascinating about them is that they're secreted from one tissue, so it can be any peripheral tissue, even neurons, and then they can circulate and act on other tissues. And that's called an epigenetic mechanism because they can basically silence the expression of a gene by going into that cell and then acting on a target sequence, a target gene. Or target RNA, so it's product. And by that mechanism, they can impact many molecular functions in a cell. And these can then also, they have a potential to serve as biomarkers because if, let's say, a process through that activates a microRNA is more active in neurodegeneration or Alzheimer's disease, and that leads to that microRNA circulating at higher levels, that may serve as a biomarker. And here we have these two microRNAs that that we found were increased after sleep loss, and we know that sleep loss is tied to neurodegeneration. So it could be that those microRNAs should be monitored more for detecting people who are at increased risk of neurodegeneration if they carry out shift work in the long run.
And so we're talking about like policy changes earlier, and that may not be policy change per se, but like, what do you think would be necessary? Like, what amount and type of data, I guess, would be necessary before this will be used clinically?
Right. So I think that with any type of biomarker, what you need to know is that you can reliably measure them, that there's a sort of normal variation between individuals so that you can identify what is like an outlier. Um, and you need to know what impacts it. Like, are there other factors that, increase or decrease it and so on? And so we need to find something that's for sleep loss. There's a lot of research going on to identify markers that's sort of a molecular fingerprint of either, let's say, insufficient sleep. So meaning that we have identified individuals who, for example, shouldn't be on the road because their driving is likely impaired. Um, or maybe like we were just talking about now, who may be at an increased risk of disease. But I do think that we need far more research, which involve both larger cohorts, and we need to be monitoring them over time to understand if how much the relationship is causal, because we need to measure them at the beginning and then at follow-up, and preferably we would do so repeatedly. I mean, if I could do it, if it was possible, if I had all the money in the world, I would do multiple times per day, and I would like, I would do it, maybe initially like every day for a week or so, and then I would do it like every week for a very long time. But unfortunately, I don't have that from me, and with the world economy and so on, we're not going to get that.
What a dream, ruler.
Yeah, and I would also, I mean, I would measure from different, not only like blood, but it would be perfect to also like take urine and all of that, everything at the same time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll do some PET scan of like a marker of our entire. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. But so we need to know that they can be measured reliably. We need to know their distribution.
Yeah.
What more did you say that we need for, like, before we can actually start using them in clinical practice?
Yeah. We also need to know how they, like, do they differ between different ethnicities, for example, between just simple fact is men and women and different age groups.
Yeah.
Like a lot of the research that goes on, which I think is a pity in the sense of sleep research, is that it's focused on adults and typically quite young adults. But we know that some risks, they start already at a young age, like based on a young individual's sleep pattern, you can actually predict certain risks going forward, such as the risk of gaining excessive body weight. So we need to know how that biomarker is distributed in a lot of different types of people. And we also need to know, for example, are there other lifestyle factors such as diet or medications and so on that can interfere with levels, like that can affect it.
Right.
Meaning that we suddenly, because we don't want to have something that it needs to have a high sort of predictive value, but also a high negative predictive value. So we know that with certainty, if it's low, it's not predicting disease at all or that risk. But if it's high, it has we're really seeing something that's specific for that risk.
Right. And it would also decrease the reliability of the measurements, right? If there were many factors that influenced it.
Yeah. So, and that, from that sense, what I think is maybe more promising, and that's also like sort of the era of multi-omics,
Right.
is that we may find sort of that fingerprint where we have multiple markers. But of course, what we want is something ideally that's so non-invasive as possible. So a blood sample is pretty non-invasive, but maybe it would be even better if we had a saliva test or urine test.
Yeah.
Because those can, you could just ask someone to even collect it at home and send it by mail even.
Right. Do you think that there are any such biomarkers currently that are reliable for understanding sleep quality or quantity, either retrospectively or predictably in future?
I think that based on what I've seen, that there's really promising research into the area, but I wouldn't say that as of this moment, I wouldn't put my hand down and say that we have found the definitive one or ones.
Yeah. And so even for these microRNAs, for example, it's still preliminary data.
Yeah, I think that the microRNA area is especially an area that's very early stages, because that hasn't been, partly because of the technique and so on. I think it's been as widely researched.
Yeah. Right. If you zooming out to not only biomarkers for measuring sleep, but also for sleep science in general. If you had all the money in the world, like you said, what research questions would you start trying to answer?
Oh, wow. Well, for example, I do think that it would be really interesting to have a biomarker that tells us how much of, let's say, a process that's specific to deep sleep or REM sleep has been going on during the night. That just, I don't know. It's a very spontaneous thing I thought about, but like, how can we know that? Because basically we know very little of what goes on apart from being able to disentangle, like see when we have non-REM and REM sleep. But it'd be really interesting, especially thinking about metabolism, to know what metabolic processes are activated during those sleep stages. We know a bit about, like, there are these oscillations in the brain that seem to regulate our glucose metabolism. But if there was a biomarker to tell us how well that's sort of, if we have a memory of that we could sample during the day and reflect what happened during the night, that might be interesting.
Yeah.
Um,
Can I ask you one more question about that?
Yeah.
So is it your intuition that such a biomarker exists and that we just need to pour more resources into research? Or do you think it's more of a dream than a reality?
I think it's somewhere in between.
I see. Yeah.
Yeah. No, but I do think, like, related to that, what we could do, why we would definitely need more research is basically being able to study things during sleep. And we're getting there to some extent by doing, like, we can measure glucose levels during sleep while we also measure sleep parameters. And then we can find out that sort of relationship. But it's still like a very superficial level, because we're, on the one hand, we're studying like a systemic metabolism, and we're just, and on the other end, we're looking at the brain and how that's reacting. Yeah. So, and I know that there are like promising avenues that we could, for example, sample breath. There's really fascinating work where you can sample your breath and its metabolism. So that could also be a potential useful biomarker avenue. But yeah, I think that we need a lot more research to find one that's reliable.
Right.
And I think that another one that would be really interesting would be, because the brain is so inaccessible, right? So thinking back to the microRNAs, it could be that something like the microRNAs could serve as a very early marker of a sleep-specific neurodegenerative process. Like, let's say we know that the glymphatic system, this system that is considered to clean out the toxins from the brain during sleep, it's way more active during sleep. That is essential for taking out these proteins that would otherwise increase the risk of neurodegenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's. But it might be useful with a biomarker that tells us how active that system is during sleep, and if for example impairments in that occur in specific individuals based on the type of sleep disruption they have and so on.
Yeah. And now we're talking about biomarkers that would be relevant for pretty much the entire population, or at least the entire population, but not these specific subgroups that we found do not have the same pattern of variation of these biomarkers. Do you think that precision medicine and finding biomarkers that are maybe quite rare, but when they do show certain patterns of variation in the blood, do you think that's an important path of research as well that we should do in parallel?
I do. Yeah, I do think so, because, well, in some sense, I feel like, I mean, sleep, it impacts everyone.
Yeah.
But that also means that in some sense, it feels like it gets less interest, because it feels like something that's just natural, which is not, obviously, because we have so many people who complain about it.
Mm-hmm.
And so it actually impacts everyone. But that means that, like you said, there may be sort of subgroups who we haven't discovered, who actually are the ones that suffer way more, who are the ones who would have a much higher risk of developing, let's say, Alzheimer's if they don't sleep enough.
Yeah.
So yeah, in that regard, I do think that and that may be where we just need more data to be able to follow and understand what is the combination of, let's say, genetic and molecular and other lifestyle factors that can help predict why someone would, with that specific sleep pattern, would develop a disease later on.
Yeah. So how actionable is genetic data? Like if someone discovers that they have either a heterozygous mutation or a homozygous mutation of, for example, the clock gene, which is involved in these circadian cellular rhythms. Like, what can they do about it?
Well, I think that they wouldn't have to worry as much. Like, there's these specific mutations that are that I would say are interesting, that are that run in certain families that are predictive of, for example, these natural short sleepers. I think those are like the most prominent way that a gene variation or mutation manifests.
Yeah.
That they have discovered. There's a lot of that research that's been done at UCSF in the US.
Mm-hmm.
And those are really fascinating individuals where someone through those mutations is able to cope with much less sleep. We don't really understand why, and that's like you could say that argues against sleep being of importance, but it's only those individuals who are able to, that rare individuals that are like some in the thousands or like a few in the tens of, in 10,000 people.
Yeah.
Those few individuals are those that are able to seemingly cope with less sleep and manage quite well over time. But those individuals would probably know that they have that type of mutation, because they would, the whole family would be very short sleeping.
Right. And they still manage quite well.
They do, yeah. I've heard from the researchers themselves, so that those individuals, they're quite intelligent. Typically, they might have very good memory. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of, they're these counterintuitive people, if you think about it, from what we know that sleep does, right, from other. Because again, all the experimental studies, when we deprive people of sleep, they show, of course, that it matters. So we know we know the causally that sleep has this great importance. But then there are these certain individuals that seemingly have these mutations that sort of seem to renders like sleep more effective.
Right.
That they get.
Could be that. Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Do you use AI in any way in your research currently?
Yeah, I do. I think it's great to get like initial overviews and find new maybe avenues to think about, like research questions, or like what evidence there's out there. Obviously, it always has to be taken with a grain of salt. Often it miscites studies.
Yeah.
Might point to the wrong study.
Right.
It's a lot of hallucination.
Yeah.
But it's kind of a fun tool to play around with, just knowing the constraints.
Yeah.
And also when we do, like in my group or in my research, I do like programming or scripting. to analyze data.
Mm.
I think that AI can be quite helpful often. Or let's say if you haven't annotated your code that you're writing, AI could do it really fast.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. So programming is irregular. Yeah.
And sometimes when you want to summarize text, I also think that it can help.
Right.
Do quite a good job.
Yeah. So this is, it seems to me quite a large percentage of the tasks that you do as a researcher.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that AI is quite helpful overall. Like, I mean, who knows? One day, like soon, maybe I've seen some pretty amazing stories that may lead us to believe that as researchers, part of our jobs may be replaced at some point.
Mm-hmm.
And I think even as like physicians, like that, just think about radiology,
Right.
a lot of routine assessments, like combining data, like just the fact that it can just like in less than an instant, like combine all the clinical parameters and figure out what the combined picture sort of or diagnosis could be.
Right. Yeah, I agree. It's very interesting, and I'm also hopeful about the benefits, but of course there are risks that it could go wrong if we don't, like using radiology as an example. Like if I guess it's more of a risk with false negatives than false positives then. So it doesn't find what we're looking for, and the doctor didn't look at the image,
I think
that would be a problem.
Yeah, but you could probably get both, like, and need to lead to unnecessary testing and treatment. That's also a risk, I think.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. So,
But one area that I'm really hopeful about, you also thinking about some policy changes
yeah,
that I think are just not good for researchers is that there's so much administration. Like I've seen both the U.S. and the Swedish side, maybe more so on the Swedish side. I think that there's so much administration, and that's where I think that AI could, if implemented correctly, like actually speed up a lot of things, like becoming like you were a real assistant,
right.
and just knowing you because it could as long as you take care of all the integrity and so on and privacy issues, that it could be really customized to help you.
Right.
Yeah. And you could think about and that sort of personal AI agent, I'm sure we'll see. I've already seen that like some devices that, track health and so on, they're starting to get these AI features.
Right.
So I think we'll just that have like personalized AI agent, it's going to explode, but I think it can, by alleviating administrative burden, I think that's a really useful area.
Yeah. So with the exponential growth of these AIs, also maybe there will be exponential growth of the enjoyment by researchers of their. Yeah. That was fun. What tasks do you think? Because it sounds like for researchers, then, like doing what you're doing now seems, at least in the medium term, to be still something that researchers will have to do for work, like formulating hypotheses, like selecting which of the AI's ideas are relevant in the grand scheme of things. As a physician, what tasks do you think that AI will not, in, let's say, 20 years,
That it will not, or what?
they will not replace physicians?
I think everything that involves like patient interaction, first of all, like that type of because there is a lot of trust that's needed and so on.
Yeah.
And there's just like the way that you can evaluate a patient is involves a lot of cues that you may be able to pick up through like knowing how relationships work and like the patient in question. So I think that's especially where you'll have the need. But I also think that even if we get these AI systems to improve and have like really high diagnostic accuracy, I like the way that at least these AI systems are now, the way that they're built on these LLMs that are sort of like auto correct or auto predict, that we will always in for those need a human who can verify that there isn't some really dangerous prediction that it's made based on the available facts. So it needs to be like a fast sort of fact checker the whole time.
I agree.
Someone who hits the approve button, who goes through the evidence. Like it's great that the AI summarized it, but
Yeah, I definitely agree, and I see many risks of just letting go of control of that. But I wonder, like, whether it will be a gradual process of people just trusting the AI more and more, and seeing that, okay, well, it works, and I just press accept. And then errors will happen anyways.
I do think, I can definitely see that as a scenario. So I'm sure that we'll soon get to the point where AI made an assumption, the doctor thought it was correct, but then actually it led to some quite serious diagnostic or treatment error.
Right. So I guess the takeaway is to do what you're doing, to keep thinking for yourself.
Yeah, and I'm also worried that it's going to dumb us down, honestly, because there is even there's some studies out that
I've heard.
So I think it'll be more so even a challenge. I'm mostly worried about the educational system. Like, how is it going to change, for example, how we train medical doctors or researchers, those that didn't grow up with this need to actually from scratch find the source or go through critically different types of source material without the aid of an AI.
Oh, you're saying those who are growing up with it need to also learn how to do that.
Yeah. To really just be without an AI.
I agree. So if people take away just one message from this conversation, what would you like it to be?
To prioritize sleep, but to also think about how, first of all, individual it is, and that there are also, of course, other lifestyle aspects to it, such as that are important, like diet and physical activity. And of course, that it's okay. You don't have to worry about if you mess up your sleep for 1 or 2 or 3 nights, don't worry. The body has a really amazing ability to tell you that it needs more sleep, and it's good at recovering. So I think that we just shouldn't go around worrying too much about it, and not using those wearables to be totally fixated on all those metrics.
I agree. I think that that's a risk with those wearables, and that it's important to remember that one can oftentimes still perform, for example, cognitively. Well, the studies do show that some aspects of cognitive performance are not as good, but still I think that probably the larger effect would be the belief that you can't perform because you have sleep deprivation. That would probably reduce the performance more.
Yeah, I'm sure that anyone who's listened to this podcast and this episode, and then they'll go and test themselves tomorrow, and then they'll think about how much they slept, and if they didn't sleep enough, they're going to be much worse off. I think that, like you said, just think more about how you feel and go after that.
So do you have any website or so that you want people to go to?
Oh yeah. So we do have a Facebook group, which I like Facebook because it's it feels more civilized than X, the way it's developed, even though X is very dynamic. putting it one way. But yeah, so we have this Facebook sleep science group, is what it's called, sleep science. But it's not only sleep, so it's also circadian science. And me and Christian, we run it, Christian Benedict. And then I also have my Instagram account. My X account is J Cedernaes, so J in my last name, and which I also have on Instagram. But there, my professional account is Sleepy Dr. Cedernaes Clocks. So it's kind of just a fun name twist.
Yeah, that's the. And I will make sure to link to those places in the show notes of this podcast episode.
Thank you.
And thank you for coming on the podcast.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Sabi.